Welcome to the Journey Home. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this weekly program, and it's a great privilege that I have every week to introduce to you guests who've made the journey home to the Catholic faith. My guest for this evening is Michael Gilstrap. He's a clergy convert to the church, and we'll talk about that in a moment. He will talk tonight on two themes that are very closely related, though I think some have a question about their relationship. On the one hand, we'll talk about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, but we'll also talk about the redemptive value of suffering and how important they are together. He's the president of the Tennessee Family Institute, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I want to remind you that you're an important part of this program. So if you'd like to pose a question to Michael, you can call us at 1-800-221-9460, or you can send us an email at journeyhome@EWTN.com. Michael, welcome to the Journey Home.
Thank you, Marcus.
You know, I've heard about you a number of years ago. Scott Hahn and I were mutual friends, but also Bill Stettelmeyer, the president of EWTN, reminded me of your journey.
Yeah.
And reminded me to have you as a guest.
Bill's a good friend.
And you're also the president of the Tennessee Family Institute.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We'll talk a little bit about that later, but maybe quickly before we jump into all the rest, what is it?
Well, we're really a think tank. We support, defend, and strengthen the family in the public arena in Tennessee. We're a state-based think tank focusing on social issues.
So during the break later, there'll be an address or phone number, especially for folk in Tennessee.
Absolutely.
That have questions about the family. They can contact you.
Yes.
But as usual, let's begin. Invite you to share the early part of your spiritual journey for the audience.
My folks are great folks. They were not Christian my first 13 years. My dad's a career Air Force officer, and so we moved all over. So when folks ask me where I'm from, I say I'm from everywhere and nowhere. You know, but we were converted as a family, really, to the Baptist church when I was 13. We moved next door to a Baptist preacher, and he led us all to Christ. That's right. First time my dad saw him, we were out in the backyard. We just moved in. I was, 12 years old, 13 years old, and this guy comes sauntering across the yard near our fence, and my dad leaned over and said, "This man's a preacher." And sure enough, he was. And, and I'll forever be indebted to them. Because that's where I really learned to follow Christ, was first learned to follow Christ. But I was a Baptist, went to college, went to a small liberal arts college in Dallas. We were living in Texas, and began to question the depth, I guess, of the Baptist theology. I was a major in philosophy, a minor in Greek, and was dissatisfied. Ended up becoming Presbyterian in the process. And really that's where my journey into the Catholic Church started, because I started questioning the foundations upon which I'd been converted, and so it was easy to question all along the way. We were Presbyterian. I graduated, and I had, from the time I was 15, I'd wanted to be a preacher, and so I was on a track to be a pastor. Started at a Presbyterian seminary, and then was convinced that I needed to, I didn't need to be a pastor until I was 30, because I thought I shouldn't be a 24-year-old telling somebody what to do. So I sort of took a hiatus a little bit and worked at a think tank down in Texas, Institute for Christian Economics and Geneva Ministries, and actually ended up running Geneva Ministries for about 10 years. Along the way, I was a member of a Presbyterian church that uniquely went through a conversion of its own from a very traditional Presbyterian congregation, looking at liturgy, looking at the way of worship, looking at communion and the Lord's Supper in a new light. And this little congregation in Tyler, Texas, ended up becoming an Anglican church. And so
the whole church,
the congregation, ended up, and now it's what's called a Reformed Episcopal church. It's sort of a halfway between Presbyterianism and Anglicanism. But in the process, I was pulled along with a love for liturgy and a love for understanding the Lord's Supper and Christ's presence in the Lord's Supper, I was pulled along to become an Anglican. And so I attended an Anglican seminary down in Austin, Texas, and was finally ordained a deacon and then a priest. And I felt God's call not just to be a rector of a congregation, but to be in a mission and to plant churches. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to go out and win people to Christ, make them good Anglicans, good Episcopalians, and bring them into the church. And that's so we moved to Middle Tennessee, Nashville area, Franklin, Tennessee, to take over a small mission there and to do just that. And so that's kind of my...
Part of the Episcopalian Bible Belt, right?
Yeah, absolutely. not well known in any way.
Being a bit facetious here, because really as an Episcopalian there, that wasn't the big strength.
Oh no,
right?
we're, every time you turn around, you're either running into a Baptist or turn the other way, you run into Church of Christ.
Your journey is very similar to mine in the sense that when the conversion of Christ comes, it's almost an immediate sense of giving our life full time to Christ in the ministry, but then also not just managing some church somewhere, but cutting edge, planting churches, evangelizing, so that others would have that same life-changing experience. I mentioned that one of the themes for tonight is the theme of redemptive value of suffering. What was your view back then as an Episcopalian minister in Episcopalian theology, Protestant theology, of suffering?
It's, in some Protestant theology, it's not on the map. The so-called health and wealth gospel, where suffering is somehow negative, completely negative. Yeah. Our theology, though, it was more, we would quote Romans 8:28, all things work together for good, and we couldn't make sense of it, but we knew somehow God was involved and it was okay.
Okay.
But we would still, if someone were dying or there was a problem, there wasn't real pastorally a way to help them through that, other than and it was what we did. We pointed them to Christ and said, be near Christ.
Yeah. And there was no, as we'll talk later, there was no connection between you and me in our suffering.
Correct.
It's something I did, I suffered, had to put up with. Again, you mentioned the more extreme view was, if I really loved Jesus, I wouldn't suffer. I mean, that's the health
If I really had
gospel.
faith, I'd be healed.
Yeah. Or maybe where I came from was the real strong Calvinist view, and that's God's will, that's His plan. I just have to accept it and move on, knowing that on the other end of this thing, God's in control.
Right. Just
get myself through it.
Yeah.
Didn't see any value in it per se. And that's kind of a common view. Well, then what was it that finally got you? You'd said that early on you had kind of started your movement towards the Catholic Church, but what got you heading straight in?
It went from literally college days till we were received in August 15th, 1995. It's Feast of the Assumption. And the journey was from a dogmatic standpoint, from a theological standpoint, the Lord really was gracious to me. I didn't have, like some of my friends, they've had this all crammed in the last few years. Mine was all along. I mean, there was baptismal regeneration, the efficacy of the sacraments, all of that came along because I was high Anglican. Okay. We called ourselves Anglo-Catholics, in fact. We consider ourselves Catholic. I had, at our little mission, I was able to go and find Catholic churches who were dumping all their holy hardware, and I picked them up. I had a beautiful tabernacle that we had on our altar, and it was right in the center of the altar, and I really thought Jesus was there.
If a Catholic happened to pass by and step into your parish, it would probably look very much
look very Catholic. I wore a chasuble. I wore the vestments of a priest.
So you had already worked through a lot of the dogmatic, doctrinal stuff already.
Except for the Pope. And I just believed that we were Catholics. We were just a different branch of the Catholic Church.
Okay.
And I loved being a pastor. I loved it as much as life itself. I have a family. I have 7 children. I adore my family, and I'm faithful to them. But I love being a pastor. I love doing that. I'd done it since I was, wanted to do it when I was 15. And as an Anglican working in the South, it's a hard sell.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult
Were you
rode a
viewed
hoe.
almost as
We
if
were
you
Catholics.
were Catholic?
Oh yeah. You know, I looked like a Catholic priest. Wore a collar, backwards collar, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And you know, all the direction of the rest of the world was going the opposite direction. Here we had this very traditional liturgy. You know, ringing the bells, incense, the whole 9 yards. And yet everyone else was going to this, you know, kind of a television sort of thing with a more entertainment value.
Very emotional.
Yeah. So, but I worked real hard at his Holy Cross Anglican Church in Franklin, and I was convinced that God wanted me to be there. I was convinced He'd called me to be a priest. And we did everything under the sun.
What got your attention to start really making?
Well,
I mean, it's a big sacrifice.
I had tried everything. We had, you know, I knocked on doors. I'd done cold calling.
Tried everything.
Mailing,
Trying to plant the church.
Planning the church and getting it rolling. We had about 30 people, maybe. You know, we'd have 75 after a big campaign, and this was in 1993. I worked real hard. Of course, our big services were Christmas and Easter, just like most other places. Yeah. And at Christmas '93, I had really spent a lot of time working to, you know, bring in a crowd, bring in some folks. And at that Mass, at midnight Mass on Christmas, we had no visitors.
No new people.
No new people. Yeah. Just folks that I knew. And I was devastated. Yeah. I had, you know, again, I said I'd embraced most of Catholic doctrine, and the only thing that I knew in terms of my calling and God wanting me to be in this place rather than that place was if He blessed me. And at that point, you know, I did a holy hour every day. I went before the tabernacle. I thought Jesus was in the tabernacle, and I know Jesus was there. I know the Holy Spirit was there. Yeah. And so at Christmas, because I was so upset, I hardly made it through the Mass. I was really devastated because I just knew that God was going to bring some new people. I just knew it. And then when He didn't, I didn't understand. Yeah. And I went to Him after we had a reception after, champagne and all that stuff. Everybody's happy and they're giving out presents and things. And after I sent everybody home. This is probably 2 o'clock in the morning now. And I stayed. I wanted to stay, and I literally broke down. I cried. I was angry. I was mad. I walked around the sanctuary yelling at Him, yelling at God, telling Him, I said, I don't understand. What do you want from me? I said, I'll do anything you want. I will be whatever you want me to be. I said, I've told my people, my congregation, and I would say it in sermons when I preach on the sacraments. I said, if what I do here at this altar does not confect Christ, does not bring Jesus here, because we believe in transubstantiation. Yeah. Then
as a high Anglican.
As a high Anglican, yeah. If what I do here, it doesn't bring Jesus here, then I want to go, the next Sunday, I want to be there. Wherever Jesus is, that's where I want to be. And I was upset, and so, again, the Holy Spirit led me to, make a deal with God. Christmas '93. I said, all right. And I'd been thinking about becoming Catholic. I said, if I'm going to work real hard this year, and if you want me to be a Catholic, a Roman Catholic, and you want me to leave here, then you just don't bless me this year. But if you want me to stay and be an Anglican priest, then you bless me this year. And bring in people. You don't have to bring in a lot, because I'm not, if you got 50 people, you bring in 25, you think, it's a super revival, And
I was thinking that planning your Episcopal church down where you were doing is very much like Gideon in the Old Testament asking for it was the miracle of the fleece.
Yeah,
I mean, it's about as much of a miracle as causing that congregation to grow in a very difficult
small
area.
Rural town. Yeah, it was a rural town. So I did. I worked hard that year. And as the year went on, and no matter what I did, it didn't work. In fact, faithful members were transferred out, and they left. So I'm sitting there, looking at this, and it's just dwindling away. No matter what I do, it's going the wrong direction. And I realized somewhere toward the end of the year that it was time for us to become Roman Catholic. And my last Mass was Christmas 1994. And after that Mass, I'd resigned, and I didn't tell my congregation what I was going to do. I didn't think it was right for me to, I had a responsible position there, and I didn't believe it was right for me to try to lead them somewhere else. So we, as a family, my wife and at that time 6 children, we became Roman Catholic. I mean, we entered the process of instruction and all of that.
I'm not sure that all in the audience would understand or appreciate, let's put it that way, the significance of maybe the prayer you were making, because I know as a clergyman that you and I both had given up other careers because we felt deeply in our heart that this is what God has called us to do. And knowing that was, okay, Lord, I will do this. And we expected that, okay, that there would come blessings with that because he would equip us and enable us and guide us to do what he wants us to do.
Not make us rich.
Right. But accomplish his will.
Yeah.
So when it doesn't come around, you wonder, did I miss here?
Yeah.
What am I doing wrong? What's happening here? What are you trying to tell me? And that was the fleece that you laid out before the Lord. And then of all things, let me ask you this. It meant calling you to the Catholic Church. What about that calling?
That was the hardest thing. I have, again, good friends that have come into the Catholic Church, and it was a joyous event. This was painful for us. Real painful for me. I had spent, 22 years, at that time I was 37, with my ladder against the wrong wall. And then I discover it's against the wrong wall, and I've got to climb down and go do something else. And it was difficult, and it was painful for me. I left something that I loved, I still love. Relationships that have been probably broken forever among some of the folks, and are just lost. Godparents of my children are gone, won't talk to us. On and on and on. You've heard all the stories.
Well, I know as we shared earlier about your journey, it was pretty obvious that 2 of the themes, one, this personal following and surrender to Christ no matter where, but also the issue of suffering and the redemptive value of it. Even as you looked at that fleece you laid out there, Lord, why is this happening to me? How do I understand this? How do I interpret this? And we thought that'd be a good theme because we don't often cover it here on this program. And maybe talk for a bit about, now as a Catholic, how do you understand the value of suffering?
One of the things that I doubted as I was going through all of this was if my prayers were getting out of the bedroom or out of whichever room I was in. And I see now that the pain that I went through in becoming Catholic, and I was a breech birth, if you will. I mean, coming out the wrong way and everything else. The pain that I went through as a Catholic prepared the way for me as, becoming a Christian, because I could then listen to things like Bishop Fulton Sheen. I used to listen to his tapes as an Anglican, and he would say things like, well, if we could only harness all the suffering that's in those hospitals as I drive by, we could convert the world. And I thought, well, what in the world does he mean by that? And then I realized as a Catholic, beginning to look at the catechism and listening to teaching and the instruction that we received when we were coming into the church, that as Catholics, we can take our suffering, whatever it is, big or small. I feel real presumptuous even talking about suffering because I haven't really suffered. But take my suffering and apply it to somebody else. Apply it to somebody else's needs. Give it for the vocations of my children, or for someone that's sick, or someone that I want to see converted, or for the ministry of Tennessee Family Institute, or whatever. And that joined with Jesus in his suffering, it has effect. It has values, and it means something.
That's a part of the working of grace. And I think you mentioned that statement by Fulton Sheen. I think if I had heard it back then, it wouldn't have been on the scope for me. I wouldn't have gotten a clue of what he means, that if we could harness the suffering, what are we harnessing in suffering? It's a very powerful sharing in Christ's suffering. And I thought we'd go to that verse in Colossians, which is one that you and I both kind of jumped over, right? I never preached a sermon on this. I don't know if you did.
No, rubber lips.
But talk about what this verse maybe meant then and what it means to us now. It's in Colossians 1:24. Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake. Just that alone is a powerful phrase. I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake. And in my flesh, I am filling up what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ on behalf of his body, which is the church.
I don't know that I understand it today, but the way that I understand it is that there's some way in which my suffering, voluntary or involuntary, whatever I'm going through, that my suffering matters and that it counts and that it's important in the life, in the application, in applying the grace of God, the life of God to other people. And that I can offer that for the poor souls in purgatory. I can offer that for people my relatives that have died. I can offer that for people that are alive today. And I can offer that suffering. And that somehow the body of Christ must follow Jesus. Just like he went to the cross, as the body, we have to go to the cross and suffer too. And individually, we have to do the same thing.
It's as if salvation is getting from here to here. And the other end of that is perfection. Mm-hmm. You are to be perfect as my heavenly Father is perfect. And all the different Catholic or Christian views in the world have different criteria for getting from here to there. And many don't include suffering in that.
Right.
They push it aside, whereas Catholics recognize that Jesus says that it's an essential part because we are to imitate Christ. And he's on the other end of that journey. And what do we see there? We see the crucifix.
Absolutely.
We see his sacrifice on the cross, which won us our redemption, which we're a part of. Another verse which, again, I jumped over, but it's right a part of Romans 8, which we won't take time to reflect on it very much, but it reminds us of the power of this suffering, which it says, the Spirit's in verse 16, the Spirit itself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if only we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. Right? It's a necessary part of the journey. Does that mean we ought to go running after suffering?
No, I don't think so. There's plenty there for all of us along the way.
I throw that out because that's the other extreme, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, the one extreme is that if I'm suffering, there's something wrong, and the other says, if I'm not suffering.
Yeah. And that's why it's important to have a spiritual director. It's important to have somebody that you can go say, well, what should my suffering be if I'm going to volunteer to do some suffering, whether it's just not putting salt on food or sitting up in my chair straight or driving 5 minutes with the air conditioner off or something. What's reasonable for me to do?
And this is a good theme for here we are in the first week of Lent. Mm-hmm. Some people say, why are we doing this abstinence? Why what's the point of fasting?
Why are we eating fish on Friday?
Yeah, what's the point of all that? Well, it's this sacrifice that we make for Christ. And it trains us too.
Yeah.
When we have to make the biggies.
Yeah.
The other theme was our personal relationship with Christ. And that came out. I think there's those that think as Catholics that that's not a Catholic dogma. Right?
Well, it is.
Talk about it.
My mother had a stroke 2 years ago now, pretty bad, brain aneurysm. And so I was back with the youth director that kind of led me to Christ and all these people and that were from my childhood or from my teen years. And they sat down and they said, we were sitting there talking about my family and, you know how you are in a hospital and talk to folks. And finally, the youth director's wife, her name's Dorothy, she's very bold. She finally said, she slapped me on the knee and she said, I understand you're Catholic. What happened? and I said, and I think I was inspired to say this, but I said, well, you taught me to follow Jesus, regardless of what the cost is and wherever he leads. And that's what I'm doing. I'm following Jesus. And it was just on December 93 when I was in front of that tabernacle, I was trying to follow Jesus. And I would go and I would talk to him. I would talk to him. We would have conversations. I'd tell him about my day. An hour's a long time sometimes. and I would say every day I would go in and just tell him what's going on. I would pray, I would sing, I would talk to him, and I would try to carry on a relationship with him. And my relationship is like a little kid. And when I'm hurting, I imagine being able to crawl up into Mary's lap and being able to, and she hugs me and gives me a kiss. And Jesus holds my hand. And it helps. When you're suffering, that helps.
Is suffering a necessary criteria for a personal relationship with Christ?
Yes. And you can't make it without it.
Yeah. So when you think about friendship, if you really think about friendship, it's sad that so many do teach that the personal relationship with Christ leads you to this life without suffering, without poverty. But when you think about true friendship, the closer you are to someone, the closer you share in their suffering.
That's right.
In fact, the more you'll be willing to suffer for that person.
That's right. Think about the people you suffer with the most. They're the ones you love the most.
And it's this great mystery of that our suffering somehow has this redemptive value.
Yeah.
It's one of the greatest mysteries of the church. I think, of all the things the many things that were great gifts and treasures coming into the church, discovering the theology of offer it up.
Yeah. Offer it up.
Maybe I'll just take a second. What does it mean to offer it up?
It means to have a suffering, whatever it is, and to think of an intention like poor souls in purgatory, or your son or daughter, your mother, and to tell the Lord, I want to offer this suffering for them, for their sake. Very simple, very easy, doesn't take much time, and He applies it to their account.
It doesn't take being a big theologian. It's really just trusting God.
Yeah.
That God is the big picture.
You're going to suffer anyway, so you might as well make the best of it.
With a couple moments before the break, let's talk practically. Both in these themes, maybe for the audience. Practical suggestion on helping someone, first of all, grow closer to Christ if they're on the walk, and then also talk about dealing with suffering.
I think in our everyday lives, we can do simple little things that make that get you, the presence of God. For instance, greeting one another's guardian angels. I mean, just making a point in your life, and I'm terrible at it. I'm trying my best right now. I'm trying to do this, but when I met you, I said hello to your guardian angel first, and do that mentally, and just do. And when you do that, everybody you meet, well, it affects your conversation, it affects how you deal with people, it affects you live the presence of God in your life. Greeting pictures of Our Lady, or having places, where you walk around during the day, or statues of Jesus or something, or little crosses. Yeah. And just make a point to always say hello. Yeah. And then do what I like to do, which is, and I know lots of others, and somebody taught me this practice when I first was converted, was to go by and see Jesus. And go by the tabernacle, and if I'm ever in a place where there's a chapel, go by and make sure I say hello. And a priest told me this, and I've never forgot it, and I almost think about it every time I go into tabernacle, that how happy Jesus is to see me. That when I walk in the door, He smiles. He's emotional about me walking in to say hello to Him. And if you think about that, it really motivates you, because you want to go by and see Him.
You mentioned three things that really answer both of those areas. And I'm thinking about maybe some of our non-Catholic viewers that may not exactly understand what we're just talking about. But, the idea of when you see a picture or a statue, it's like a signpost reminding us of Jesus. That's what they're there for. They constantly remind us of His presence. So both drawing us closer to Christ, but also the value of the pictures and the rosary are also there in the times of suffering to remind us that our Christ has been there before. Mm-hmm. He's been there before us. He knows that suffering personally. And also you mentioned going visiting the Blessed Sacrament. It draws us closer to Christ, but also reminds us of His suffering. The guardian angels. As Catholics, we're very aware of the supernatural, the vertical element of our lives, right? Yeah. Both drawing us closer to Christ, but we're never alone in the midst of suffering. Mm-hmm. Our guardian angel is there. We're going to take a break really quickly, but before I do that, one quick word on the Tennessee Family Institute, which they'll see a phone number for, I think, during the break.
We're, again, as I said, we support, defend, and strengthen the family. Any viewers in Tennessee, or really anywhere, we'd be happy to send you a newsletter, a free newsletter, and a brochure on our work. And if you're in Tennessee, though, especially, please call I think they're going to give you the phone number, but
Okay.
there's a voicemail, so you can call anytime and
All right,
leave
great.
your name. Or
Great. Well, then stay with us. We'll be right back for your questions. Welcome back to the Journey Home. My guest for this evening is Michael Gilstrap. He's been talking about his journey to the church, but also we've been comparing and contrasting these two key themes, which are part of our journey, and that is the committed following, surrender to Jesus Christ, but also the place of suffering, the redemptive value of suffering, and how they really fit together like a glove. You can't have one without the other. If you don't have a relationship with Christ, you're not going to really get the value or understand the point of suffering. So we're going to take some of your questions. In fact, we'll begin with our first email, if we would. Dear Marcus, this comes from Pat Bogert. Thanks for your great show. You've hit on a topic that has long perplexed me. I understand the concept of redemptive suffering, using Christ as our model. What I can't seem to figure out is just exactly how we offer up our sufferings to Christ. Thank you, Pat, for that good question.
Well, in my Presbyterian days, there was a Dutch theologian who wrote a book called Knowing and Doing. And he argued that you don't know before you do, and sometimes you do, and then you understand. Mm-hmm. And in answer to Pat, you just do it. I mean, just, like Nike, you just do it. and if it's a problem with, this is a problem that I have. I'll have something that comes up during the day, and unless I've thought about what intention I have for the day, what I want to offer my suffering for, my efforts for during the day, then I forget. So I try to choose something every day to offer my suffering for. And then it's right at the tip of my tongue. So it might be for the vocation of my children, or for my wife, or for the Institute, or for whatever. Poor souls. And so during the day, if a driver pulls out in front of me and I'm tempted to say something I shouldn't say, I offer it up. I say, Lord, I offer this up. I had to slam on my brakes and I spilled my coffee and this and that, whatever happened. And this guy, who knows who he is. And I offer that for the poor souls. And I do that every day. I try to.
I hate it when something happens and I get angry. And I feel like I've lost it. I've lost the redemptive value that was a gift that was given to me, and I just lost it. I blew it away. I threw it off. But then it's mea culpa. Lord, forgive me.
Yeah.
And you get it back.
Yeah.
All right. But that theologian you're talking about was actually borrowing from a great old Catholic truth.
Yeah.
Faith leads to understanding.
That's right.
And sadly, so many people stand back from having a relationship with Christ because they've got to understand everything first. I've got to figure it all out.
Yeah.
How is it that God has predestined all things from the beginning of time, but somehow my prayers can change his mind? I mean, how does that work? I don't know, but pray.
And that's your Calvinism coming through.
Yeah, that's my old Calvinism. That's my old Calvinism. I'll tell you what, let's take our first phone caller this evening. This is Maury from Louisiana. Hello, what's your question for us tonight?
Yes, sir. I would like to know what readings you would recommend on the redemptive value of suffering.
Oh, thank you very much.
Good question.
What do you think?
I would read the part of the Catechism, the New Catechism.
Maybe two I could throw in there with that.
Go ahead.
Is that John Paul has written
a
wonderful encyclical on redemptive suffering, and I can't remember the title of it. I'm sure you're Catholic.
Salve Fici Dolores.
It's a wonderful presentation by our Pope on this whole thing.
Pretty meaty.
It's very good.
Pretty tough. Yeah.
And you might even look and see if you can find somewhere a copy of some of his recent speeches that he gave at Mexico and at St. Louis. He dealt both with these same two themes.
Two issues.
Of surrendering to Christ and the importance of suffering. But the Catechism is a great place to begin, as well as John Paul's writing.
It's in bite-sized chunks.
Yeah, you have to take it slowly, that encyclical. Let's take our next email, if we would. I wonder if you can answer a question for me. This comes from Sandy in San Jose, California. My mom has suffered from Alzheimer's now for 13 years. She's in the later stages of the illness. She cannot speak anymore and seems to be in her own little world. She has suffered most of her life from one ailment or another. Since she was not a practicing Catholic other than going to Mass once in a while, I know she did not know to offer her suffering up to Jesus. What I want to know is, can I offer it up for her? I have had a priest go to her home every few months to anoint her for the sick. I know she is not capable of sin in her state of illness. Is she now in a state of grace? Well, she's getting a bunch of questions here. Thank you, Marcus, for the journey home and all who ministered to your program. All right. Now, you and I are neither of us theologians or academians here. We probably should have a priest join us for some of these. But let me go back to the first question. Can we offer up someone else's suffering?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
But you can offer your own. I mean, you can offer your suffering, and that's what God asks. That's what God expects of you, to offer your suffering. And
well, through the relationship she has with her mother, there's suffering.
Yeah.
Because of what she is going through.
Right.
I mean, our wonderful, merciful Father knows that, and He's not going to say, "Well, I'm sorry, that's her suffering. You can't mess with that." No,
but
it's the suffering
it's the
that we
daughter's
share.
suffering. Yeah.
That's right. So we do share in that. I mean, that's really the point you got to earlier. Do it. Offer it up. Offer it up, all the suffering. She gets to another issue where she asks, I know she is not capable of sin in her state of illness. Is she now in a state of grace? Now, again, we're jumping into
She's in the hands
mystery.
of a merciful God.
Okay.
She's in the hands of a merciful God. Beyond that, I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. A priest wouldn't know. It's between us and the Lord. Whether any of us in a state of grace is between us and the Lord.
And she's in the best hands she could be in.
And so we look at what is the most practical, the most helpful thing that a person can do in this situation where the person can't speak and seems to be, as they said, in a world of their own. We offer the suffering up. We pray constantly. We get others to pray. We ask the prayers of the saints, and we ask the Lord, who knows that person's situation better than anyone else, to have mercy.
And at the Mass.
Yeah.
And maybe I hope she's Catholic.
Yeah.
You know, at the consecration. You know, when you're there at the Mass and the priest is offering Jesus on the altar, then you put your mom there and you offer your mother, and Jesus will hear.
This next email reminds me a little bit of that one. It kind of tags onto it, but again, I wish we were theologians on this issue. It says, hi, Marcus and guest, comes from Laura. Great program, thank you. My question is, does suffering have value if we do not offer it, like the suffering of a non-believer?
I don't know the answer.
Again, there's that mystery of that. The value, I've thought about this recently, it was kind of like this. Someone who's...
I know Fulton Sheen thought some of it must have been wasted because of his statement.
That's right. So we want to get more people. I was going to get on to a comment I was going to make, and that is that someone who's, let's say, dying or struggling with an illness, and we want healing. We want healing for that person's life. Well, I think I mentioned this last week, that if that person were to be healed but didn't believe in Christ or didn't have a relationship, and they were healed, they may not put two and two together.
Right.
They might understand where that healing came from. It's kind of the same thing with suffering. I mean, they haven't a clue of why they're suffering, or maybe even that if they're not healed, that God has His plan and purpose and mercy in that. And so our goal is to kind of aim at the other, bring them to a relationship with Christ. There's what we want them to know, is to know Christ and surrender to Christ, so they can make a piece out of the puzzle. In your journey, you mentioned earlier that in some ways you went right from high Anglicanism into the Catholic Church, and a lot of those themes are kind of answered right along the way. Was there any particular doctrine or dogma that you still had to struggle with a bit as you're making that jump?
Well, the authority issue, the Pope, was what kept me out of the Catholic Church. As an Anglo-Catholic, I thought we were Catholic. We had what I thought we had, everything but the Pope. And he was the Bishop of Rome. He was just like our bishops. And so I had to, during that year, when I was testing God, I also had to study. I had to study about the papacy. It wasn't a critical. It was a critical factor in one sense, in that it had kept me out of the Catholic Church. But on the other hand, I was committed to becoming a Roman Catholic if God, kept His end of the bargain, whichever way it went. And so at the end of that 12-month period of time, and we decided to become Roman Catholic, then I submitted to God and said, okay, we'll become Roman Catholic. And that meant, ipso facto, that the Pope's right. And I was, it's like somebody asked me, I had, in an earlier life, I had defended vigorously the death penalty, and had written on it and published and everything else. And someone said, after I become a Catholic, he came to me and said, well, what do you think now about the death penalty? And I said, well, I was mistaken. And why are you mistaken? Well, because the Pope says I was mistaken. And I can give you some reasons now that I'm mistaken. But the bottom line is that because the Pope said it, I believe it, because he's the Vicar of Christ.
Now, for those that are not Catholics listening, we might want to clarify this. So if he wrote a letter on the best way to play golf, would that be the way you play golf?
No. He didn't write a letter on the best way to play golf. I mean, his teaching. I don't have a personal relationship with him, so he hasn't given me any golf tips or hockey tips as he was in St. Louis. But he publishes encyclicals, his letters and his apostolic letters, and the catechism and the other things that he's done during his pontificate. And that teaching is authoritative. It's something that I have to listen to and that I need to pay attention to. And that's where the authority is. And if you look at the other churches, mine included, the Anglican Church, we have Anglicans all over the place. We have Anglicans ordaining women as bishops. We have Anglicans ordaining homosexuals. We have Anglicans doing all sorts of things. Yeah. Even among traditional Anglicans, there were those who were like me, who were, believed in transubstantiation, or, called it the Mass and everything else. And there were others who were quote unquote low church, who read the Bible and did their thing with the Bible and had morning prayer, maybe did a communion once a month.
So you're left with just grabbing for straws, which particular person you want to listen to, or which person's maybe more of a charismatic speaker, or wrote more books, or puts together a more convincing argument,
or thinks like me.
Or thinks like that's where I was. Yeah. That's where I was. But the issue of the Pope is just not that every word that comes out of his mouth he'll do like a puppet. But the point he's as the Vicar of Christ, he's in a position, and he has the gift of the Spirit, and when he in union with the Magisterium, he's the authority that brings unity to the Church. Let's take our next caller. Hello, this is Danny from Florida. What's your question for us tonight?
Hi, Marcus.
Hello,
Excuse me. This is Danny from Niceville, Florida, and another great show. Actually, you've just really led right into my question,
right.
and it all comes down to authority, and it's what one authority a person accepts, and I think of Mark Shea's book, By What Authority, where he talks about that, and how he changed in his faith, and how he accepted the Pope, but. My question for you guest is, as a staunch Anglican, as you were in that church, and you stated before that a lot of the practices, a lot of the traditions were very similar to the Catholic Church. Yet, what was it, or was there a point in time where you started to question the authority of the leader of your church, the Anglican Church, and why it split off from Rome, and how did you come to accept the Pope as the authority of the one true Church?
How did you make that jump?
That's a good question. I don't think I questioned. We had a theology that we called the branch theory, and we were a branch of the Catholic Church with the Roman Church and with Orthodoxy, and the Anglicans were, in our theology, was another branch of the Catholic Church. One of the things that really happened was during the, directly to answer the question, I have always been comfortable with authority. I've never had an authority problem as such. Therefore, when I was praying to the Lord and said, Lord, if you'll do this, if you bless me, then I'll be an Anglican. If you don't bless me, I'm going to go be Roman Catholic. That was it. And I was going to go a year. And I figured that, and whatever happened, that's what I was going to do.
Yeah.
And so at December 1994 comes along, and God had not obviously blessed us. We became Roman Catholic. And it was that was it. It wasn't a crisis of faith. I didn't have to doubt my bishop's authority. I just realized that I had been mistaken for 20-something years, and needed to go become Roman.
I know that as I hear you talk that way, it reminds me of, to make sure the audience hears, and the sense of that was a real deep, strong conviction that God answers prayer.
Yes.
I mean, you really believed
I knew that, yeah.
You knew that to be true. I mean, that led you to the ministry, it led you to all you were doing. You knew that God would speak. There's no doubt in that. So if you live that way and you believe that, then you got to take a step on it when God answers.
Right.
Otherwise, you're left on your own, right? Your own.
That's exactly right. And I want to say this too, that this is a little bit to the man's question, but my practice at the time was, I prayed the rosary. I went, I talked to saints. My patron saint was Francis Xavier, because he was such a missionary. And so I would drive around Franklin praying the rosary, asking for a Catholic revival. That was my prayer. That was my intention. At night, late at night, I would do that after the kids were gone to bed. And sure enough, we had a Catholic revival, but it was just my family. and so we had friends in heaven. Francis Xavier,
again,
Blessed John Henry Newman.
That's having the bigger picture of the communion of saints. Maybe with another minute or two we've got left, let's take this email, because it tags into a little bit what we've been saying. It comes from William. Hello, Mr. Grodi and Mr. Gilstrap. My question concerns Mr. Gilstrap's conversion from the Reformed Episcopal Church. How can other Reformed Episcopal members come to understand the importance of having the Pope to be the head of Christ's church?
Grace of God. The Reformed Episcopal Church, I never was actually Reformed Episcopalian. It's a complicated story. But the only way for the Reformed churches is for God to do works in their lives individually that pulls the struts out from under their paradigms, the way they see the world. And when he pulls the struts out, then hope they land, they're turning the right way. Because what we believe is the truth. And what they believe is not the truth. And so we present the truth to them in a winsome, gracious, loving way. And God uses that truth to make good Catholics. I mean, that's what apostolate is. Yeah. Apostolate's making pagans into Christians, people who are already Christians into Catholics, and Catholics into good Catholics. And that's what our work is. That's where all apostolate is. You
couldn't have explained better what I believe that the whole purpose of the Journey Home program is. We're not out to proselytize. We're out to present the fullness through the testimonies of men and women like yourself who've made this journey. And then we pray that God's grace will open up hearts and minds to hear the beauty of the Catholic faith as they see it in the lives of people like you and your family.
That's great. I hope I'm used that way.
It's been grace, though, hasn't it? I mean,
absolutely.
What a great gift it's been. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Great pleasure having you on the program.
My pleasure.
Thank you for your witness, and say hello to your family for us. And look forward to bumping into you again. We can talk about, you're railing on me about my old Presbyterianism stuff. Please stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment to kind of close things up and give you some words for the Journey Home. We've enjoyed talking together tonight about this issue of the redemptive value of suffering, which there's great mystery in there, because when you think about it, it's part of the reason why there are so many views out there about how do you deal with suffering, what it means, because of the mystery that's there, that it requires our faith and trust. I thought I'd close with one of my favorite passages of Scripture that deals the familiar story of the rich young ruler that came to Christ, asked him, "What must I do to be saved?" And Christ gives him the answer. And he gave him a difficult answer. The answer was to go, to sell what you have, to give to the poor and have treasure in heaven, and then follow me. And I remember long in my early part of my own spiritual journey, I took it very literally. Well, that's what he expects of us all. Go and sell and give it away and follow. And I did that. I went to seminary, sold everything I had except my guitar, I think I kept, to go to seminary. I took it totally literally. And then later came to understand that the key of this passage was that the problem for this man isn't the same problem we all have, but for this particular man, his things, his material goods stood in the way of his following Christ. So Jesus pointed at the things, the money, the riches, and said, are you willing to follow me? Then you have to let go of that. And that made sense. So I looked at my own life. What is it that stands in the way of my growing closer to Christ? What is it in your life that stands in the way of your growing closer to Jesus Christ? But then as a Catholic, and understanding a bit more of Catholic theology, and I've got a long way to go, I began to see that there's even a deeper meaning in this passage. You see, it wasn't specifically the things themselves that were standing in the way, but what was involved in this passage was Christ's call to suffer. To suffer. You see, Christ had given him 4 commands, each a more deeper commitment of suffering. He first had to go, and then of all things he had to sell, and then of all things he had to give it away, and then he had to totally follow Christ. Each a deeper step into being more like Christ, each a deeper step into suffering. In that story, he could only do one thing, which was to go. And he couldn't do the other suffering. And you realize by rejecting those calls to suffering, he actually suffered the greatest because he suffered the loss of Christ himself. A part of our following of Christ requires suffering. It requires us setting aside the things that stand in the way of Jesus, no matter how hard it is, but asking God to give us the grace so that we can let go, so that we can totally receive Christ. He calls you and I to make all these little steps every day. What is it in your life that He's called you to let go of, or to accept, or as we said earlier, to offer up for the benefit of our own lives, for the benefit of the church, the benefit of our families? Let's walk together with Christ. We don't suffer alone. We suffer with Jesus together. God bless you. See you next week on The Journey Home.